We're ready to start painting our skin color texture. However, before we can add our digital paint to the model, I want to make sure we understand why skin is notoriously difficult to achieve. And in my experience, it's primarily due to the translucence in the skin. The fact that light absorbs into our skin and passes through it, which doesn't mean we can see through the skin, but we sort of can. And therefore, the skin is not really one specific color. In reality, it's a combination of everything that's underneath the skin. So let's jump over to our handy anatomic model to understand this a bit better. And if I have the skin, the color of our skin model is quite misleading because it's that flesh tone that we see from the outside, and the epidermis is not this color at all. It's actually much more desaturated and can even lean towards a blue color. And so when you combine that color over top of the yellow fat and the red muscles, the blood also, as well as some parts where the bone color is more prominent, the combination of these components is what results in this flesh tone that we see from the outside. And there's two ways that we can approach this. We can try to keep it simple and get away with painting a color texture that matches what we see from the outside, the combination of all those components. Or we can break down our textures into separate layers that simulate those anatomical layers. And spoiler alert, we're going to go with the first method because it's much more straightforward. But I want to go over the basics of the second method so we understand it. If I jump over to our trusty google.com, I'm going to type in SSS layers. That SSS is a common acronym for subsurface scattering. You can also type that in, subsurface scatter. And you should basically get the same results. We're going to look in images. Of course, it's a lot easier to just type in SSS. And I recommend you take note of the terms that we will be searching because it will help for you to flesh out your own knowledge by checking these things out for yourself. But there's various examples in here of people breaking down the translucence of the skin into subsurface layers. And I'm going to highlight this second result because it's a Blender artist. From back in the day, about 10 years ago, Ben Simmons was a pretty big name in the Blender space. I'm not sure what's happened to him over the years, but this tutorial back in 2010 is what I used to translate my subsurface knowledge over to Blender. So I highly recommend you take a look at it. A lot of good information in here, but there's this image that I want to focus on where he breaks down the texture layers in the subsurface material. And so I see layer 1 as being the epidermis, or the epidermal layer, the outermost layer of skin. And here it's gray, much more desaturated, not quite towards blue. In my experience, I've pushed it a little towards blue, which can help. And then the second layer is subdermal, and this is trying to capture the combination of fat and muscle and blood. And then the third layer is often referred to as backscatter. And mostly it's black, so inconsequential to the skin, but it helps to dial in the deepest parts of translucency, like the ear. Whenever you see a backlit head and the ear is glowing noticeably reddish orange, that's where backscatter focuses. And these three layers are pretty standard for creating a realistic skin shader. I used to use this method exclusively for all of my portraits in the early years. However, it's a very convoluted way to work. For example, when you see the combination is supposed to look like natural skin, and this looks good, but if you're working with this and you're thinking, I want the cheeks to be a little more red, well, which texture do you change? If we go back, do we add more red in the subdermal, or do we add the red to the epidermal? I don't know, do we try it in the backscatter? Is that where the red in the cheeks is coming from? We don't really know. So we probably have to test each one. And that's kind of how the process always goes for me. Instead of dealing with one skin texture, you're dealing with three, and it's just really confusing to work that way. And at this point in my career, I'd say it's not worth it because I've never found the results that this delivers to be undeniably superior to the single texture method. But it's definitely a thing. I've used it. It's valid. People still use it today. But thankfully, I don't think it's objectively the best way to go. And therefore, that leaves us with the first method, the single texture method. But even though this is going to be more straightforward, it's still confusing. Because if we jump over to some photographic reference, I'm on unsplash.com, my trusty source for high quality CC0 public domain images. I'm going to search studio portrait. Of course, photographs is going to be something you want to study for achieving realistic renders. But even figuring out what a skin color is tricky. So as I scroll through these images, of course, each photograph is drastically different because of lighting, as well as skin tones are unique to each person. I think there's a good example with this person. Let me open it in another tab and then scroll down. I think there was another one. Yeah, here. Okay, so same person, looks like the same photo shoot, but in this one, the lights are colored, making the skin really bad for analyzing what the actual skin color is. This one is white and more brightly illuminated, so it's a better example for analyzing what the skin tone is. However, it's not perfect because there are significant shadows, significant skin reflections, and the harsh reality is that no type of photography or lighting is going to be perfect for analyzing skin color. However, there is a technology that achieves this, and it's called polarized photography. So if I search polarized skin photo and look at our images, Texture.xyz has a really good write-up about what cross-polarized photos are. And here at the top is a regular photo. Now they are using as much light as possible without casting shadows, and it is white light, of course. But then the second photo shows that the specular reflections, the white parts of the skin, have been eliminated. Now I think there is still technically some like shading involved, like shadows on the either side of the nose. So even that's not ideal, but they do get rid of it, I believe. Yeah, in this example here. Somehow I think they have a post-process that removes the shadowing, or maybe it's part of the cross-polarization. Anyway, the technology is possible, and this is the ideal example of what we want for a skin color texture. No shadowing, no specular reflectivity, only the combination of epidermis, muscles, fat, and bone of the underlying anatomy. So it's pretty wild that this technology exists. Now it is pretty high tech and it's not cheap. I could not find any free polarized photographs, so we're gonna have to pay for it if it's what we want to use. And texturing.xyz has a great library of photo sets of various people, including polarized versions. However, let's be honest, we're Blender artists and we're trying to pay for as little as possible when it comes to creating our art. I understand that. It's how I work too. And so for my personal portraits, I tend to use a more DIY approach, and that's what I want to show you here. So polarized photography is not an option for us, but definitely remember the term and search it for yourself. It's a really interesting technology and certainly worth the money if you want to buy a photo set. But I am left with Unsplash and typical photographic portraits to analyze skin tone. Now, I already spent over an hour digging through these photographs to find ideal lighting to create a convenient reference sheet for us to use. So I'm going to go back to Blender. I'm going to, let's see, create a new workspace dedicated to image viewing. All right, give me a second to set this up. I basically just want one image editor. Okay, and I'm going to open from the reference folder, Skin Color, CC0 Skin Color. All right, and this is a collection of faces that were as close as possible to the ideal lighting conditions. We're never going to get to a polarized level, but what's common in all these images is more broad, shadowless white lighting. All right, that's our best chance at an authentic skin tone. And none of them are ideal. For example, there is shadow on this person's screen left side of the face, but the screen right side of the face is pretty good, even though there is a specular highlight on the lips and on the cheek. This one has far less specularity involved, but, you know, of course, always be mindful of shadows. And let me see if anything else is noteworthy for these images. Something to keep in mind, though, when it comes to photographs of women is they tend to be photoshopped and or makeup applied. So in the world of photography, you're already trying to idealize skin and, in other words, manipulate the reality. So in the case of this photograph, I think it's obvious that she has been touched up. And so, you know, it just comes with the territory. It's something to be aware of. There are some photographs here of what seem like more natural female faces, like this one. Both of these, actually. But this one's pretty high in makeup, it seems. So be aware of that when it comes to women. Of course, men might have makeup too. And let's see, speaking of men, you know, of course, you're going to have to often deal with facial hair and what that does to the skin tone, make it a little more ambiguous. There seems to be some pretty obvious image manipulation with this photograph. This one seems more natural, and this one's actually very close to that ideal lighting that I'm looking for. There's virtually no shadowing, or extremely little shadowing on the face, but you know, he's got glasses that kind of cover up those skin tones in the eye. But all of this is going to be very helpful for achieving a competent skin texture. Now, the last thing I want to discuss is simplifying the skin tones. Because if we focus on this image here, I think most people can notice that, yes, the lips are noticeably more red than the cheek, or that there's some reddish orange in the ear. While those are more noticeable, there's actually a lot of subtle variety that's less noticeable. Like, for example, the slight yellow around the caruncle, or the more pinkish hue around the eyelids. The fact that it goes a little brownish orange on the outside corner. You know, there's some pinkish red underneath the nose. And anywhere that there's hair follicles growing, the skin tends to lean a little more grayish, if not blue. And those things are a lot more subtle and difficult to analyze. And so I've created an alternate version of this, which I will open. And it is Skin Color Simplified. So all this is blurring the image and then applying a filter that uses fewer colors. If we zoom in here, you know, there's fewer choices to color pick for when we paint our texture. And this really helps me in identifying those more subtle skin tone variants. However, there's one more thing that I like to keep in mind. It's another concept when it comes to skin painting, and that's the idea of color zones of the face. So if we switch back over to our browser and I create a new tab, and let's type color zones of the face and take a look at images. This concept, I believe, comes from painting, but obviously it's relevant for us painting a skin texture. And it's the idea that the upper third of the face leans toward a yellow tone, and then the middle third of the face leans toward red, and then the lower third leans toward bluish, greenish gray. And so it really helps to have this kind of simplified rule, or not so much a rule, more of a guide, to push our texture into the right direction. And if we look at some of these other results, you can find examples of more isolated versions of these skin tones, like this female face here. Also, this example kind of puts the yellow, red, and blue in more specific spots. However, you saw me roll back from rule to a guide, and that's because, in my experience, it's certainly a useful concept, but it's not rock solid. For example, like I said, the grayish-bluish tone on the lower third seems relevant due to hair follicles that grow in a beard, but women don't really have that. But also, in theory, if I wanted to test this on a photograph, I could simply bump up the saturation, and we would start to see the blue come out in the lower third, the red in the middle third, and the yellow on the upper third. I've created a third version of this image that does exactly that, bumping up the saturation. It's called Skin Color Simplified Saturated. And we really don't see those color zones show up very well. And maybe that test is imperfect, because I really do know that a beard tends to make the skin look more blue. And you can just ever so slightly see this in the photograph here. But you don't really see that at all in this guy. You don't really even see it much here. Maybe a little bit in the hair. And so we can kind of connect those two. But a clean shaven face, you don't see this blue show up. You see yellow show up, but it isn't isolated to the upper third. We see it show up in the middle third too. So, you know, what do we do about this? I, again, think that the color zones rule is useful, and I keep that in the back of my mind. But I also like to use this test of blurring and saturating photographs to offer another perspective, and then kind of mix those two ideas together. And based on experience, I know that we just need to get in the ballpark of believability. We need a competent skin texture. It doesn't have to be perfect. And so with that in mind, what we've discussed is going to be enough to get us there. I hope that after this long explanation, you have a better understanding of why skin is difficult to analyze and apply well. But if you follow along, I think you'll find that it is doable. And there's not quite as much pressure as all the information out there might suggest there needs to be. But we'll finally get started actually painting the skin texture in the next lesson.